So 2 years ago, Jim Matheson, was when Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl signed their contracts. Draisaitl's kicked in right away, and he's getting paid $8.5 million a year. Back in 2017, that was a lot of money for a guy who hadn't scored 30 goals yet. But here we are 2 years later, and Leon Draisaitl is a 50-goal scorer, and that contract looks mighty good right now.
Well, he's making less money than Jeff Skinner is making, and they just gave Jeff Skinner $9 million a year in Buffalo. 40.
He scored 40.
40 for the first time. Draisaitl would be in the same boat as, say, Mitch Marner, and Mitch Marner is probably going to cost the Leafs $11 million, between 10 and 11. So the Oilers have saved at least a couple of $1 million on Draisaitl. Conversely, they're still having problems with the cap because some of the other signings they made weren't very good, and which is why when it comes to free agency, they're nibbling around the edges unless you can get rid of, a couple of players that are making too much money. And that, it's problematic right now because everybody's looking at their roster and saying, if we get rid of this player, we got to give a first or a second round draft choice too, just to get rid of that player, as the Leafs did with Marleau. Not only do they not have a very good team, but they're up against the cap, unlike a lot of teams. Like Carolina made the Final Four last year, and they have acres of cap room. The Islanders, were good last year and have lots of cap room. The Oilers were not very good, and they don't have much cap room.
You talk about nibbling around the edges. That's what they had to do last year. The big signings were Kyle Brodziak and Tobias Rieder, and Tobias Rieder's not
qualified.
Not qualified by the Oilers.
He'll be in Europe next year, I would suspect, back in the DEL. Ty Ratty, they didn't qualify either, so he's leaving. But you're right. They signed Kyle Brodziak, and they keep bringing in players, and you look at it and say, where's Kyle Brodziak playing? They weren't happy with Kyle's game last year, not because of his offense, because they don't think he won enough face-offs for them, and he was a healthy scratch a few times. I still think he's a good National Hockey League player, but he's a $1 million fourth-line player who might not play every game, and you're saying to yourself, do you want that, or do you want to put him in the minors and bring up somebody else making $700 who's younger and faster? So I would say he's in jeopardy of at least playing in the minors, not being bought out. But as long as the Lucic contract is there at $6 million, as long as Chris Russell, who I think is a really good player but is overpriced probably in today's market at $4 million, is there, and Andre Sekera is making $5.5 million. The Oilers have some sticky problems in terms of bringing in top six players to help out McDavid and Draisaitl.
And near the top of the list, if not the top of the list, is a goaltender to join Mikko Koskinen in a tandem, or at least as the backup to him. We're talking about bringing in a player that's not in the upper echelon of goaltenders in the National Hockey League. We're talking about bringing somebody in on a cheap deal who, maybe not, will push Koskinen in that role.
Well, I think you can get by in today's NHL unless you have a Carey Price or a Vasilevsky or a Braden Holtby or a goalie who is clearly a number one goalie. You can play a 1 and a 1A as Carolina did last year and as the New York Islanders. That's the prime example with Thomas Greiss and Robin Leonard, where they each played half the season, had the lowest goals against average in the league, and they were the surprise team in the league last year. You can get by with a 1 and a 1A, which is why the Oilers have to get a goalie who can push Koskinen, as Koskinen was brought in last year to push Talbot.